Alert! Russia sends oil to Cuba. Russia has sent 790,000 barrels of oil to Cuba in an act that strongly resonates in the current geopolitical landscape. This shipment, transported by the impressive tanker Academic Gubkin, arrived at the Bay of Nipe in the province of Holguin, at a time when the island is facing one of the most severe energy crises in its recent history. The presence of this gigantic vessel on the Cuban coasts not only represents a temporary relief for the country's battered energy infrastructure, but also symbolizes a clear challenge to the sanctions imposed by the United States and a reaffirmation of the alliance between Moscow and Havana, which remains firm despite international pressure. The energy crisis in Cuba has worsened considerably in recent years, due in large part to the economic restrictions imposed by Washington, the decreasing availability of its 15 thermoelectric plants, and the lack of resources to operate smaller diesel generators. As a result, the island has been hit by prolonged blackouts that have plunged its population into darkness for hours and even days. This situation has forced the Cuban government to take drastic measures, such as the temporary closure of schools and instructing non-essential workers to stay at home. In this context, the arrival of the Academic Gubkin becomes a fundamental respite for the country's economy and social stability. The presence of the Academic Gubkin in Cuban waters represents an act of open defiance against the sanctions imposed by the United States that have tried to restrict Cuba's trade with the rest of the world. The Academic Gubkin is more than just a merchant ship. It is a symbol of resistance against Western sanctions. The vessel has been on the sanctions list of the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control since January 10th of this year. Its inclusion on this list is in response to a broader policy of restrictions aimed at the Russian oil industry, which has affected a total of 183 vessels. Many of these are part of the so-called shadow fleet, a group of ships that operate outside of Western legality to facilitate trade with countries that defy Washington's sanctions. Despite the restrictions, the Academic Gubkin managed to complete its journey from the port of Ust-Luga in the Baltic Sea to the Bay of Nipe without declaring its destination on maritime tracking platforms. This tactic, common in Russian crude oil shipments to Cuba, is intended to avoid surveillance and sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies. Its journey through international waters undetected represents not only a logistical success for Russia, but also a political message of solidarity with Cuba and defiance of U.S. hegemony in the region. The shipment of Russian oil is not the only sign of Moscow's support for Havana. As part of its strategy to strengthen its relationship with Cuba, the Russian government has granted a $60 million credit for the purchase of fuel, in addition to a further donation of $2 million for the acquisition of essential parts and components for the maintenance and repair of the Cuban electrical system. These measures seek to alleviate the energy crisis facing the country and guarantee the operation of its energy infrastructure in the short term. The Cuban ambassador in Moscow, Julio Antonio Garmendia, confirmed the signing of the agreement formalizing this financial support and highlighted the urgency with which both countries have addressed the problem. According to his statements, the contract that will allow the execution of the agreement will be signed in the coming days, which demonstrates Russia's commitment to Cuba's energy stability. The shipment of Russian oil to Cuba is not taking place in isolation, but in a geopolitical scenario marked by the tightening of U.S. sanctions. The recent re-election of Donald Trump as President of the United States has meant an intensification of restrictions against Cuba, including the reactivation of the list of state sponsors of terrorism and the suspension of operations of companies like Western Union, which were a key source of remittances for thousands of Cuban families. In this context of growing economic pressure, Russia's support becomes crucial for the survival of the Cuban economy. Not only does it represent a source of essential energy resources, but it also strengthens Cuba's position on the international stage as a nation that, despite sanctions and the blockade, continues to have allies willing to challenge the restrictions imposed by Washington. The United States economic embargo against Cuba is not a new phenomenon. It dates back to February 13, 1962, when then-President John F. Kennedy signed a decree that marked the beginning of more than 6 decades of economic isolation. Despite changes of administration in the White House, this policy has remained largely unchanged, limiting Cuba's access to essential goods such as fuel, food, and medicine. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez has called the embargo a criminal act and a sustained economic war against the Cuban people. On 31 occasions, the United Nations General Assembly has voted against this policy, but the resolutions have been systematically ignored by the United States, which has persisted in its strategy of isolation against the island. Despite these adversities, Cuba has found ways to resist, relying on strategic alliances, such as the one it maintains with Russia. The recent arrival of the academic Gubkin not only helps to mitigate the energy crisis facing the country, but also strengthens the political and economic relationship between the two nations. For international analyst Carlos Rafael Dieguez, the United States policy of sanctions against Cuba is a historical injustice that has seriously affected the Cuban people. According to his analysis, the lifting of the embargo would not only restore normalcy on the island, but would also represent an act of respect for a nation that has resisted US pressure with remarkable tenacity. However, with the recent re-election of Donald Trump and the tightening of sanctions, any hope of relief seems distant. Meanwhile, Russia continues to consolidate itself as a key player in Cuba's resistance to external pressure. Its financial and energy support provides a respite in the midst of the storm, allowing the island to continue functioning despite the difficulties. But beyond the economic issue, the shipment of Russian oil represents a direct challenge to the isolation strategy imposed by Washington, demonstrating that despite the sanctions, Cuba is not alone. On the streets of the island, the intermittent glow of electric lights reflects not only the fragility of its energy infrastructure, but also the determination of a people that, despite the challenges, continues to resist. The arrival of the academic Gubkin is a spark of hope in the midst of the darkness, a reminder that despite adversity, Cuba continues to move forward, navigating the turbulent waters of international politics with the determination not to give in to external pressure. In recent years, Cuba has been strengthening its ties with the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This alliance offers Cuba new opportunities for economic growth and development, despite the ongoing embargo by the United States. The BRICS countries have shown interest in investing in Cuba's infrastructure, energy, and healthcare sectors, providing a much-needed boost to the island nation's economy. These investments are crucial for Cuba, as it seeks to modernize its infrastructure and improve the quality of life for its citizens. As Cuba continues to navigate its complex geopolitical landscape, its partnership with BRICS could pave the way for a more prosperous future. The collaboration between Cuba and BRICS is not just about economic gains, but also about fostering a sense of solidarity and mutual support among these nations. This new era of cooperation holds promise for a brighter future for Cuba and its people.